There is a story in Australia that should not exist. It describes a coastline no living person has ever seen. A coastline that vanished 10,000 years ago. And it does not describe it vaguely. It names which hills were once islands, where the river ran before the water came, where families camped, on ground that now lies 60 meters beneath the sea. For most of the last century, science had one word for stories like this: myth. Then geologists mapped the ancient seabed, and the map matched the story, not loosely, point for point, along thousands of kilometers of coastline from more than 20 separate peoples, most of whom had never met. This is the story of the oldest accurate memory on Earth, and of how close we came to throwing it away. To understand what these stories remember, you have to picture an Australia that no longer exists. 20,000 years ago, the world was locked in an ice age. So much of the planet's water was frozen into ice sheets that the sea sat roughly 120 meters lower than it does today. Australia was bigger, dramatically bigger. Tasmania was not an island. You could walk there. You could walk to Kangaroo Island, to Rottnest. The shallow seas you fly over today were open country. Plains, rivers, lakes, forests. Something close to 2 million square kilometers of land that is now seabed. And people were living on it. They had already been on that continent for tens of thousands of years, the oldest continuous culture on Earth. They knew that country the way you know your own street, where the water was, where the game moved, which ridge caught the wind at night. They camped on it, hunted on it, buried their dead in it, painted it, and then, slowly, it began to disappear. About 18,000 years ago, the ice began to melt. This was not a flood in the way we picture floods. There was no wall of water, no single terrible day. It was worse than that, in its way. It was relentless. The sea climbed, on average, about a meter every few decades. In the fastest stretches, it moved inland several meters a year, fast enough that a person could stand on a beach as a child and return as an elder to find that beach gone. Fast enough that one family could be forced to move camp again and again within a single lifetime. Imagine having to explain that to your children. The water is not going back. The place your grandmother described is not there anymore. Over roughly 10,000 years, the sea swallowed all of it. Hills became islands, valleys became straits. The edge of a continent quietly redrew itself. And the people who watched it happen did the only thing they could do. They told the story. And they made sure it was told, exactly. Here is where most of us underestimate what an oral tradition actually is. When we hear the words passed down, we picture a game of telephone, a message decaying a little with every retelling until nothing true is left. That is not what happened here. Aboriginal knowledge was carried by a system built specifically to stop that decay. Stories were bound to law, to song, to ceremony, and to particular places in the landscape. They were held by designated custodians, people responsible for one story. And other people were responsible for checking it. Getting a detail wrong was not embarrassing, it was serious. Think of it as quality control, running across generations. A story could be corrected by people who had learned it separately. The result is a system that can carry precise information further than writing has existed. Writing is about 5,000 years old. These stories are older. So, what do they actually say? Near Melbourne, traditions describe Port Phillip Bay as dry land, a place where people hunted and gathered food before the sea broke through. The bay is shallow. Geologists agree it was dry, and that it flooded roughly 10,000 years ago. In Western Australia, stories describe Rottnest, Karnak, and Garden Islands as part of the mainland, connected by country you could walk across. Sea level maps put that walk underwater about 7,500 years ago. On Kangaroo Island, tradition holds that people once crossed on foot from the mainland. The strait that separates it drowned around 10,000 years ago. In the far north, the stories tell of a time when the sea lay far out, and where the reefs are now, there was land. And beneath the water, divers keep finding exactly what you would expect to find. The debris of lives lived on ground that is no longer ground. Stone tools, grinding stones, drowned forests still rooted where they grew. The systematic work of testing these traditions against the geology was done in the 2010s, most prominently by a geographer, Patrick Nunn, and a linguist, Nicholas Reed. They gathered accounts from 21 separate locations spread around the entire Australian coastline. Different language groups, different landscapes, in many cases peoples with no contact with one another. Then they checked each account against sea level reconstructions, the hard data of what the water was doing and when. The stories matched the geology, again and again and again, which produced a number that made a lot of people deeply uncomfortable. To describe that coastline before it drowned, these traditions had to have carried accurate information for at least 7,000 years. In some places, closer to 10. 10,000 years is about 400 generations. 400 times someone had to tell it right. And it may reach back further still. In Victoria, the Gunditjmara people hold a tradition describing the creation of a volcanic landscape, a giant and the eruption that followed. That volcano is Budj Bim. Recent dating puts its eruption at around 37,000 years ago. If that story is a memory of that eruption, and serious researchers think it may be, then it is the oldest story on Earth still being told. The same people built something else there, a system of stone channels and weirs engineered to farm eels, thousands of years old, older than the pyramids. And for decades that was dismissed too because it did not fit what the newcomers expected to find. So what do we do with all this? The easy conclusion is the comfortable one. An old culture turned out to be right. Everyone nods. We move on. The harder conclusion is the one worth sitting with. For 2 centuries, this knowledge was not hidden. It was not lost. People were saying it out loud to anyone who would listen, and the people who arrived with maps and instruments decided in advance that it was folklore, because of who was speaking. The information was never missing. The listening was. And that raises a question that has nothing to do with Australia, because right now, all over the world, there are traditions describing floods, vanished islands, coastlines that moved, mountains that burned. A few have been confirmed. Most have never been seriously examined at all, which means that somewhere, possibly in a language with very few speakers left, someone is holding a piece of the human record that no archive contains. And the only thing standing between us and it is whether anyone bothers to ask. If you want to know what else the official record got wrong, subscribe. There is far more of it than you would think.